where we bring you friendly neighborhood history, history topics, Q&A, all of those great things. Happy President's Day weekend, a happy Valentine's Day. I know I'm a couple of days late, but hopefully everybody had a very enjoyable and romantic Valentine's Day. And if not, hopefully you stayed home and enjoyed your Friday night and your long weekend that many of you are enjoying, because Valentine's Day kicked off a weekend that ends with President's Day. So a lot of history evolved in those two holidays, a lot going on right now. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we talk about history in a friendly and neighborhood manner. And grab a cup of coffee, something to talk about, because I'm going to be here for a little while today. We are going to be doing 2 hours of friendly neighborhood history, an hour of Q&A, followed by an hour of lecture, where I will be lecturing on the history of President's Day and the importance and significance of President's Day and why Americans even celebrate it. And I don't know if that will take an hour, so we may do an hour and a half of Q&A. We'll see how the day goes and everything. But if you like history, if you like social studies, anything having to do with the humanities, you're in the right place, because we talk about this stuff all the time. And I apologize. I meant to obviously do my live streams Friday and Saturday as usually scheduled. And this weekend is actually our birthday. It's been a year since the Friendly Neighborhood History channel started. We started President's Day weekend of last year. And since President's Day is a good history holiday, good um, social studies holiday, our birthday is always going to be President's Day weekend. And there will always be extra bonus fun stuff we will be doing. So, yes, I have been at this a year now, guys. And I really, really appreciate all of your support and the way the channel has grown and the live streams we've been doing since May of last year. So we'll figure out how we can, or June. So we'll figure out how to celebrate that anniversary when it comes around. But it was a year ago, that the Friendly Neighborhood History channel started, and I barely knew how to do any shorts. I didn't have any equipment. It was just me kind of rambling about history. I didn't know about backgrounds and how to do that stuff. So we've come a long way. We went from only a handful of followers to nearly 6,500 friendly neighborhood historians. And being a friendly neighborhood historian is easy as liking and subscribing. And my wonderful moderator M is in the chat. He's already put down our social media handles, which you can also find on the YouTube homepage, where we have X, Instagram, Facebook, Patreon. And if you don't like the sound of my voice, but you like my insights, maybe you want to read more and maybe you're more of a reader and someone who learns that way, then join our Substack. And our Patreon, we have bonus content available for people who subscribe for free, and extra bonus content, early releases, and all the like for those who become friendly neighborhood historians there for a small fee a month. You can help the channel grow. And there's exclusive content there, including a series on the U.S. First Ladies that I'm doing right now. I have been delayed with some of my projects and some of the things I'm doing. I'm currently doing a short series here on YouTube covering the different Chinese imperial dynasties. And the next one up is the Han, one of my favorite imperial dynasties, not just in China, but of all history. And I love talking about the Han dynasty and Chinese history. I'm learning a lot just by my research and studying into making these videos and putting them together. However, I've had a bad family emergency that has struck me. My dad has been kind of detained, and I've been kind of in and out of the hospital with him the last few days. But hopefully he's watching now and feeling better and everything. And I went and saw him earlier today, and I will be going back and seeing him tonight. And hopefully he comes home very, very soon. Of course, as many of you know, the channel has also been kind of part of a forced relocation. We are in our new studio with our new lighting, our new equipment, all of that good stuff. So hopefully you're enjoying that. Hopefully you're enjoying your Sunday afternoon or evening or wherever you are. I'm just happy that you joined us. And if you like history, if you like social studies, you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. So, to make up for Friday and Saturday not being able to do sessions, for which I apologize due to my family emergency, for the next hour or so, I will be taking any questions you have related to history, social studies, and the like. So drop a topic that you are interested in learning about or interested in me covering regarding history and social studies, and I will get to it at an appropriate time. And again, consider all of those different things. And if you want to contact me directly and give me feedback or ideas, or you have something you really want me to talk about, topics and suggestions, the best way to reach me is my email, friendlyneighborhoodhistory1@gmail.com. Very, very basic, very, very generic. Email me with any thoughts, ideas, criticisms, comments. If you really, really hate my ideas and you really want to go at me for in a back and forth, then I would love to hear it. I love the channel. I love the talks we get into in the chat. So you are in the right place if you like history and social studies. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee, but thank you and welcome. And thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon or evening, wherever you are. 4:15 on the East Coast, and we got started a little bit late as I was coming back from the hospital, but we will be here for the next 2 hours, 1 hour of Q&A and 1 hour of our usual live stream lecture. And I will be streaming tomorrow, doing probably either a Q&A or a live stream lecture to make up for it before. Originally, the idea was to do 4 live streams, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, in honor of the year anniversary, in honor of President's Day, in honor of Valentine's Day, and all of that stuff. I have a video up on my YouTube Shorts about Valentine's Day and the history surrounding that, so check that out. And obviously, plans have gotten delayed, but next weekend I am going to be doing one Q&A that will last for 2 hours. So come and join us there. That's probably going to be either Friday or Saturday when I normally do them. Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern and Saturdays 7 p.m. Eastern. So I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Thank you for joining us. Like and subscribe. Think of a topic you want me to talk about or a question you might have regarding history, social studies, and the like. We are here to serve you. That is what we do here in our live streams. So thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate seeing everybody. This isn't just me pretentiously sipping coffee. I haven't had coffee today. I've been running around doing a bunch of stuff, so I am just bone dead exhausted. So if you see the bags and the circles under my eye, it's just because of everything going on. So, anyways, let's see here. Going through the chat. Show some love to my wonderful moderator, M. He does a great job of putting everything in the chat and all that stuff. Spartacus, great to see you as always. Always a pleasure. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I'm using my microphone, my new settings, and all of that stuff. Nice to see you, my brother. Welcome to the Thanos world. Yes, Aaron, where we got half of the world deleted and all of that stuff. Dimensions that you focus on: political, social, cultural, and economics and civilization. Are you asking me what dimensions that we should focus on in those things? Because you kind of brought them all up. A civilization is made up of people who are working together, and over a long span of time, and that's going to involve history, that's going to involve religion, that's going to involve cultural development, and all of that stuff. How do you think political environment impact the economy in a particular way? Well, obviously, the more power that politicians and governments have in a given area, the more they can influence the economics and structure of that area. So in ancient times, people believed that the best type of rulership was a monarchy or some sort of oligarchy that would determine most of their decisions and most of the way that people live their lives. And those people were there without questions, usually because their relatives, mainly their fathers or mothers, had been in that position before them. And so that's why you have the development of an aristocracy, of a hierarchy, and of a monarchy. That later transports into a feudal system, which is common in the medieval world, not just in Europe, but also in places like India and Japan. And where you have there is you have the king or ruler at the top, his nobles who are kind of around him in a secondary status, who own land and collect taxes from the peasants who work on that land. And in order to keep the peasants safe and also the kings and nobles safe, you have an army that's created. And you also have some social stratification because you have people who work in different fields doing different things, such as merchants and businessmen and artisans and craftsmen and things of that nature. So, Rishi, those are very good questions. Thank you so much. So much. Astro, hey, good to see you. Um, can't this is my life, so thank you. I am actually living my best life now by having a history channel and doing a lot of fun and having 6,500 subscribers and producing history content in a friendly neighborhood manner. And I went with that because I'm obviously a huge fan of Spider-Man, and I might have to change it because Marvel might have trademarked that. So, anyways, Astro, good to see you. Thank you for being here. A learning curve, Rishi, is where you're going from one level to another. So a learning curve is the path that you take, and imagine your learning is plateauing, and then a curve, you start learning more and more and developing more and more. And not just, and if we're talking about history and social studies and the like, not just people go through that, but entire civilizations and societies all throughout history. So no girls? Well, actually, I'm wearing the Hugh Hefner smoking jacket. This is my customary outfit for the Friendly Neighborhood History channel for our live streams. So this is actually what I wear all the time. And I mean, the girls go wild over it. And it's kind of the Hugh Hefner style. And I mean, we're not necessarily history Playboy, but we can talk about the history of Playboy if you'd like. Freshly, great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Kant, if you are into history, what do you think about the Macedonian phalanx? Well, obviously, those were the shock troops of the ancient world, at least the Greek ancient world, and they obviously were utilized specifically by Philip II of Macedon and his son, the much more well-known Alexander the Great, not just to conquer and unite Greece, but to use the power of the Grecian armies to destroy their main rival, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and Darius, who was defeated at the major battle of Gaugamel by Alexander. And Alexander not only conquered Persia, but Turkey and the Middle East, the Levant, Palestine, Egypt, and of course made it all the way to India before his troops insisted he go back. And everywhere he went, he spread Greek culture and ideas. And so many of those cultures militarily developed the phalanx as a way because they had been influenced by the Greek way of fighting. And the phalanx was extraordinarily effective because you had a hoplite, which was a soldier. He had a small dagger or short sword in his tunic. He had a plate of bronze breastplated armor, and yes, it was they were using iron at this time, but bronze was cheaper and easier to make. He had a large shield, and he had a long spear with a sharpened tip and a point at the end if he wanted to stab backwards. And he would be aligned in a row with a bunch of other soldiers around them, and they would march forward. And basically, they would march at a slow pace. They were easily assailed by cavalry and horse archers and things like that, like the Parthians, the later Persian Empire, would do to them and the Romans. But they were extraordinarily effective. They were slow, but they were very, very, very well armored, and they were very, very good at mowing down their opponents who just kind of ran into them. You can't really run into them. You have to either hit them from the side or from behind. So, um, yeah, 6 meters long. Yep, so 18 feet. This meter, by the way, is about the size of a yard. This isn't friendly neighborhood math, but I do know a little bit about maths and stuff like that. What do you think the U.S. drilling oils in the market as well as selling oils? Well, that's a big issue of controversy, not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world. And this is something that is a sociological phenomenon. As societies tend to develop and become more economically independent and more structured, what we call the developed world or the first world is the old, outdated term. We had the first, second, and third world countries. Um, as a society becomes more developed, certain cultural phenomenon happen to it. It sheds its religious skin and becomes more and more secularized. Religions tend to become more liberal and loose about morals and values. And you also have the development of a stronger economy where more and more people own more and more of the wealth, but you also have something called the middle class, which hadn't existed before, where you have people who have disposable wealth and are able to use it. And the United States and the West has kind of maximized this. This did exist in earlier civilizations like the Romans and the Chinese, but it has become far more prevalent in Western countries for this to develop. Yeah, so you have a loss of religion, you have a development of a middle class. You also have the new technology being used to do all sorts of different things. And you also have another, and I'm answering your question, but it's basically you have the development of environmental concerns. So more and more people have more and more environmental concerns about the not just the you develop long-term existential goals. You want people to continue to exist. You don't want to deplete the resources that have been used to mechanize and industrialize your society. And you also look at the planet around you. You look at the destruction of species. You look at the degradation of the natural environment, and you tend to become more and more conscious about this. And you have more and more wealth and means to do this because your society is more and more developed. So the truth of the matter is. The use of oil and natural gas and things like this have raised huge environmental concerns when they weren't doing that at the beginning of the 20th century for most people, because this was a way to really, really boost American and Western development. And obviously, coal and natural gas and oil and things like that help develop the modern world and help the United States and other societies become extraordinarily productive. Now, one of the issues that are so as time goes on, there's higher and higher level of affluence, but there's also a higher and higher level of environmental concerns, because these environmental concerns can preoccupy people who don't have nearly as many existential problems with finding food, shelter, and clothing. People's environmental concerns tend to make them worried about the use and overuse of resources, the depletion of those resources, or the resources usage and its effects on the environment and people's health. And that is why in the West you have more and more issues surrounding the use of natural gas and oil. And so the U.S. has tried to lead by example. The Paris Climate Accords was part of this, as a way of saying we're going to cut down on carbon emissions, we're going to cut down on the use of fossil fuels, and we're going to try to new alternative forms of green energy like wind and solar power that do not rely on fossil fuels as much and are better for the environment. So but you still, any developed society still requires the same um, resources that had made it developed to continue to be developed. So that continually means the use of oil, natural gas, and coal. And so people continue to use it. But since you don't want to produce it yourself because you don't want to be a model of environmental hazards, you start to import it. So the United States actually could be technically self-sufficient and energy independent, but it imports oil and natural gas and things like this, and kind of supplements that with of course drilling in the United States, but also the use of alternative forms of green energy. And since green energy is not sustainable enough for a developed society, the usage of oil and natural gas has to occur. and you bring it in more from other countries. The importation of these resources requires the use of oil and natural gas, especially using planes, trains, and automobiles. So as time goes on, more so there's a lot of different issues going on. There's this moral message and this moral standing, but it's undermined by the continual usage of those and production of those fossil fuels and using fossil fuels to import the very same resources that fossil fuels require. So the energy independence, things like this, these are big questions for the United States, and Donald Trump's solution for it in America has basically been the drill baby drill mechanism, wherein Americans will basically develop their own environmental independence and basically put the environment on the back burner in order to produce as much gas and natural gas and oil as they possibly can, while not relying on other countries to ship them gas and natural gas oils and things like that. So there's a big environmental discussion, but it's part of living in a developed and modern society. And modern problems require modern solutions, as the great philosopher Dave Chappelle once taught us. So long answer to a short question, but we've only got a few questions here in the chat so far. So if we get more and the audience picks up, then I'm going to be answering them at a more rapid speed. So Rishi, why do people hate mainly Hitler, but not the people who killed or involved in the Holocaust? Do you think it's one person hate? I think Hitler, because he was the dictator and Fuhrer of Nazi Germany, because he had articulated such passionate hatred of the Jews and had been able to create a level of a cult of personality where he was able to control and dominate the German people and create mass hysteria and mob mentality. Obviously gets the bulk of the blame, and that's very fair. The German people, obviously, for their culpability, deserve a lot of blame. And a lot of people were saying afterwards, Nazi prison guards and the like, who had a hand either in the exploitation or the murder of millions of Jews and other peoples, that they were just following orders. So the truth of the matter is, once there's also culpability on the part of Europe itself, because the truth of the matter is that Europe had been very anti-Semitic for an extremely long time, and that had boiled over and basically gave the Nazis the context they needed to blame the Jews for Germany's loss in World War One, or as I believe it should be called, World War Two, and to develop a culture of hatred that eventually led to the extermination of millions of them. Obviously, we've heard this a lot before, and you can watch my full length video on the Holocaust that I released on Holocaust Memorial Day, but it didn't just start off with them killing lots of Jews. And also, of course, we should mention the 5 million communist homosexuals, political dissidents, Slavic peoples, Romani, Gypsies, and the disabled, who were also put in concentration camps, worked to death, and then murdered, or just flat out murdered in death camps like Treblinka, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, or Buchenwald, or Birkenwald. There's one I'm not, and Dachau is obviously one of the death camps. So the truth of the matter is the extermination of these people took years of political demonization, hatred, motivation, and scapegoating. Basically, these people were blamed for all of Germany's problems after the war. Germany's economy didn't work. Rich communist Jews were stealing your money. They're the problem. Germany's society was becoming decrepit and weak. Well, that's because you created one model for how people should live, and that one model needs to be blue-eyed, blonde-haired white people, and other white people are somewhat inferior. Eastern Europeans are extraordinarily inferior, and then the Jews are the worst of all. And although there was evidence to the contrary of Aryan superiority, Hitler did everything he could to possibly use Aryan superiority. So the truth of the matter is that hold on one second. Sorry about that. Just had a coughing spell. So my mute button is kind of my coughing button. So the truth of the matter is they used to have those on the radio, but who listens to the radio anymore? So let me see, where was I? So yeah, there's this culture of hatred that is created over time, and yeah, that leads to the demonization of these people, which leads to propaganda, which leads to segregation, which basically the Nazis, by the way, were inspired by their segregation, by American segregation. They felt that Jim Crow was an excellent model of how they should treat Jews and other people they deemed to be socially, politically, and racially inferior. So, and yes, Hitler was indeed Austrian. He was from Vienna. He had been a failed artist. He had been injured in World War I by chemical poisoning, and he had wanted to find a reason why the Germans had lost the war. He was hired by the German government to investigate a group of radical leftists called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or the Nazis. And the Nazis basically abandoned all forms of global socialism to embrace national socialism. And Hitler was an avowed socialist. So was Mussolini. These guys were disgruntled socialists who took socialism and kind of perverted it into a form of neo-nationalism. And really the truth of the matter is that authoritarianism of all forms tends to be totalitarian, and it doesn't matter. There's almost like a horseshoe theory of politics where the far left and the far right tend to say and do the same things when it comes to amassing power and controlling people. And it was happening in Germany, and it was happening in the Soviet Union under Stalin at the same time. A lot of people know that Stalin was pretty brutal, but a lot of people don't know that Stalin killed far more people than Hitler did. He just did it in a longer amount of time. About 20 to 25 million people were killed under the Soviet regime during Joseph Stalin's 25 years as the leader of the Communist Party, as the premier of the Soviet Union, its dictator. And so that also led to scapegoat and demonization, which was part of Marxist history, anyways, because Stalin did a lot of demonization of a class of middle class and upper class of peasants called the kulaks, who were independently wealthy and who could own their own land. And that was all based in his reinterpretation of Marx's principles. So, um, basically, so Hitler was sent to investigate this extreme socialist party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and he hears their speeches, and he's actually motivated to join them, and they love his ability to speak. Although I've never found Hitler to be a particularly good speaker. I remember the comedian Norm Macdonald, rest in peace, once said that everyone said how eloquent Hitler was and how he was able to motivate a crowd. And every video we ever watched of him, Hitler is just screaming and yelling at people, which is exactly what I see. Hitler was very passionate and very good at whipping people into a frenzy, but I don't find him particularly eloquent as well. So the truth of the matter is, the Soviet, the Hitler joins the German Workers' Party and motivates them in their hatred, especially towards the Jews. And he wrote out exactly what he wanted to do in Mein Kampf when he was arrested and put in jail. His memoir, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, basically was how he was going to transform Germany into an Aryan society with socialists, with basically National Socialism being the doctrine, the Jews being excoriated, blamed, and the communists being pushed out of the country as well. So, anyways, those are just a few things there. I hope that gave you a full answer. What about Germany's economic and social problems during that time? We need to consider these subjects too. Yes. So the Germans were going through what was called the Weimar Republic, and the Weimar Republic was an extraordinarily weak government set up at the end of World War One, or as I like to call it, World War Two, the Great War, if you will, where the German Kaiser or Emperor had abandoned his empire, basically leaving it to the Allies. France and Great Britain were angry at what Germany had done during the war, so punished them, make them pay exorbitant amount of war reparations, and also made them take full blame for the war. This incensed the German people. It insulted their national pride, and it basically made them second-class citizens in terms of Western European politics and history. And so the German society and economy was extraordinarily weak. It stabilized during the 1920s thanks to help from the United States, actually. And then in the 1930s, when the Great Depression destroyed the American economy, it pulverized much more the German economy, leading to political instability, the rise of radical groups like communists and the National Socialists. And that's where Hitler was able to convince the German government, which was conservative, to embrace the Nazis as their allies because they feared the communists together. And the German conservatives and old guard, who had all been military officers and people from World War One, basically let the Nazis do what they wanted and didn't realize until too late that they had been duped by National Socialism. So, um, there's a little bit I've been talking about. If you like what I'm talking about, I mean, nobody likes to talk about these things. It's a sad thing. But if you find what I'm talking about to be interesting and compelling, then you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing and all that great stuff. And hopefully, you are able to hear me well and see and see me well and all of that stuff. Hopefully the tech is working in my favor today. Had problems with it in the past. Kevin, you're awesome. Well, you're awesome too. Devin the dude, what's going on, friendly history? Well, not too much. Just doing a 2 hour live stream to make up for missing a couple of live streams because of a family emergency. And Kant, Stalin was way more brutal. I mean, I think all of these guys are equally brutal. It's what they're working with at a particular time. And the reason the Holocaust carries so much attention is that it was systematic execution of so many millions of people, especially the Jews, over such a quick period of time. And basically, the Allies, the general public of Allied countries, had a general idea of what was going on. Well, the leadership had a really, really strong idea of what was going on and knew that there was extermination. But when the Allies, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and the United States freed the concentration camps at the end of World War II, they were horrified by the mass amounts of starvation, malnutrition, and of course execution and destruction of life that they found that the Nazis had committed. The genocide was far more atrocious than they had even ever conceptualized, and it was really, really, really bad. Richard Earl, more died in China during that time, not due to drought, but due to policies. Well, yes, there's drought and famine in China during the Great Leap Forward and Mao's policies. Well, you might be thinking, are you talking about at the same time as World War II? Because there was a civil war in China going on in the 30s. Then Japan invades the country, does horrible things to the Chinese. And then afterwards, the communist government eventually wins over. And under Mao Zedong, the People's Republic of China executes or systematically starves 40 million people. And now that is atrociously high. And you can't even conceptualize these numbers 6 million, 5 million, 20 million, 40 million. It's really the way to understand it is think of one individual with one identity gone, then the next guy, then the next woman, then the next man, and then so on and so forth. And then eventually it's unspeakable how atrocious and how huge it is. And that's not to mention, obviously, all the other destruction of life, property, and prestige for these poor people. I've always wondered about something. They say that Nazism was a right-leaning ideology, but they are a socialist ideology. I thought socialism is certainly a left-leaning thing, Richard. That's a very good question, a very good thing to point out. The truth of the matter is, it's authoritarianism, and I think what makes the Nazis a right-wing, most people consider it a right-wing ideology, is that they were inspired by Italian fascism, which became popular in places like Italy, Spain, Argentina, and during the Cold War, the United States actually let fascist governments stay in power as long as they condemned communism. And fascism hated communism because they hated the idea of a world under one communist state. They were hyper nationalists and they didn't want the nation state to lose its power and prestige. And so it was about restoring their countries, about making Italy and Germany, dare I say, great again. So because of that, communism, socialism, those things don't really add up. They don't really make a lot of sense for somebody who's trying to make his own nation great when communism was about global domination in a Marxist utopia. So that, and this put them at odds. And if you look at socialist history and you look at communist history and you look within the Soviet Union, communists and fellow far left people have never had a problem killing and destroying each other. Look at what Stalin did during his grand purges, where he basically killed off old revolutionary communists because they weren't the type of communist he wanted. He hunted down his main rival, Leon Trotsky, who was even more radical communist than he was, and made sure that he never talked again. So purging and hatred amongst these leftist ideologies is not uncommon either. So, and Hitler did affirm that he was a socialist, but I think as time went on, they definitely did as best as they could to use the German right wing, the conservative and the moderates, to basically control Germany, to preach traditional values that appeal to right wing thinking people and conservatives who ran the military. Um, and they used that in order to get what they wanted. So there's too many people in China who think, well, that's not fair. That's 40 million people. There's been people for a long time saying there's too many people everywhere. Do you think the Weimar area is asking, do you think the Weimar Republic was done from the start? I think the hate was more France than the UK. Yeah, the reason France hated the Germans so much after World War I was that most of the fighting had been done in France, and that's why so many people had died. That's why they insisted the Germans demilitarize an area called the Rhineland, which is in the Rhine River between France and Germany, because that land could then be used as German territory that the French could invade if there was another war. The French had so much suffering, environmental devastation, and decay in their own land. They didn't want to fight a war in France. And yet, of course, World War II early on was fought in France, and the French were basically decimated by the Germans. Kaiser means Caesar. Do you think they inherited Roman Empire? Who's the true heir to Rome? What do you think? So yeah, the Germans had this idea of the being the inheritors to the Roman Empire ever since the Holy Roman Empire, and that is why there are three Reichs. The first Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which was Germany throughout most Germany and other areas like Austria and and what is now the Czech Republic and Belgium during the Middle Ages, the 12, 13, 1400s. And that was seen as an empire. And then the Second Reich was the German Empire established in the late 19th century by the Prussians that was destroyed at the end of World War One. They were the Third Reich, and they believed that all of the Germans were the ancestral inheritors to the Roman Empire, which makes no sense to me as a historian because the Romans never conquered Germany. They could never subdue the Teutoni, the Alemanni, the Lombardi, all of these different the Lombards, all of these different German tribes who eventually invaded Europe and dismantled the Western Roman Empire and helped create the modern nation states, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, who became the French, obviously. These different groups basically destroyed the Western Roman Empire and reorganized the modern states of the Western Mediterranean. So that's what's going on there. Let me see here. Let me see. Just going for the chat. Yeah. Richard Earl, do you know anything about the Black Cat Division in World War II? Not a lot about it. I've heard of it before, but I'm not an expert in everything. Um, Harry is asking, what do you think of the British Empire? Well, I think it existed. I think that the British Empire is actually, if you can think about empires and how large they've actually gotten, the largest contiguous empire is the Mongols. The most impressive and inspiring have been the Romans. The largest, actually, technically the largest, is the British. The British had land in every single continent except Antarctica. No other empire has ever done that before. They owned Australia. They owned New Zealand. They owned large they owned all of the Indian subcontinent. They owned sections of the Middle East at certain points. They actually created the modern division between Israel and Palestine that everybody is so in a knot about. They also created the modern division between the Indians and the Pakistanis. Pakistan did not exist. India did not exist. That land was the Indian subcontinent that was eventually divided into the three countries of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. The British did that because they wanted the Muslims and the Hindus to stop killing each other. And guess what? It hasn't worked. At the same time, they obviously owned the United States, the 13 colonies, but even after they lost that, their empire continued to increase. They owned Canada, they owned large, and then in the 1880s, the Europeans, basically without any input from the Africans whatsoever, carved up and divided Africa, which has caused so many issues, ethnic peoples fighting each other over border disputes since then, that it's just absolutely atrocious. But the British Empire spread British influence, ideas, of course, the use of British money, and the British language and religion all over Africa, India, Australia, all throughout the entire world. They even own land, yes, in South America. So they used to say the sun never set on the British Empire, and that was because so much of the British Empire, it was all over the place, that basically if you were in Ireland and it was morning, it might be nighttime in India. But if it was morning in India, you were a British subject, part of the British Empire, even though it was nighttime in Great Britain itself. So the British Empire was extraordinarily successful, extraordinarily powerful, and then completely collapsed after the Second World War. So, Operation Paperclip. Maxine Waters, the Democratic Congresswoman, and Adolf, incite violence. Maxine, let them know they are not welcome anymore. Antifa beat up conservatives. Adolf Kristallnacht. Yes, I've heard the comparison between uh, everyone, any politician who you don't like is Hitler. I've heard this all the time. Obviously, Trump has been called Hitler so many times, it's getting really old for a guy whose son-in-law is Jewish and whose grandchildren are being raised Jewish, who has had one of the strongest relationships with Israel of any U.S. president. And Trump has plenty of problems and does seem to imply some dictatorial ideas and does have some and is extraordinarily ambitious. But I don't think Hitler has ever been a fair comparison for him. And it wasn't a fair comparison when conservatives were calling Obama Hitler. Any politician you don't like being Hitler is a horrible argument. It means you don't know what's going on. There is this issue of inciting violence and stuff like that, which a lot of people claim Donald Trump did on January 6th. A lot of people claim that you're claiming Maxine Waters did it. I mean, there's misinterpretations of statements from politicians all the time. This is nothing new in history, but yes, something that we need to understand in modern history in the last 80 years is not everyone you dislike is Hitler. So Harry, yeah, but the UK would suspend all debt and repayments unless they were necessary to pay back the US. But if the UK didn't need them, they didn't demand them. Yep, that's basically how it worked. And the United States used French bankers to actually fund the Louisiana Purchase, which would help Napoleon fight the British. So the British were actually funding their own devastation at the beginning of the 19th century. And yes, Kant, you are absolutely right. It was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was just a. It was supposed to be the Catholic. The Pope was supposed to select the Holy Roman Emperor. He was supposed to be. He was never in Rome, obviously. And by the time you get to the 13 and 1400s, he has no power and is elected by a bunch of different people called electors, who actually hold the real power. And you have different regions of Germany having different electors: Bavaria, Saxony, Prussia, and these different states would fight for influence and power until the Prussians were able to unite the Germans as one whole empire in the 19th century. So, yeah, well, Antarctica was never colonized. The British landed there, the Americans landed there, different peoples landed there, but eventually they decided in the midst of the Cold War, they made a treaty in 1960 where the UN brokered it and basically decided that Antarctica would be neutral territory and it wouldn't be a base of operations for anyone. One of my favorite conspiracy theories is that the Nazis had secret bases on Antarctica and fled there to continue working on their experiments and ideas at the end of World War II. Um, I don't know what you're saying about food, Kant, but interesting. T Love, if there was a World War III, who would be us? Us allies, and who would they fight? Like China, Russia, Iran, who else? Well, I already think there have been three world wars, technically speaking. I think the first World War was actually what we call the 7 Years' War, and I've done several live streams on this, and I should do a long length video explaining my exact theories and why I believe that. The 7 Years' War was in the 1750s, and it had fighting in four different continents: Africa, North America, in Asia, and Europe, and eventually the British were victorious in that, especially in the American phase, fighting the French and their Indian allies. So they called it the French-Indian War, and that's how the British gained Canada, by the way. So that was technically World War One. Then the Great War is World War Two, and then the war we all think of with Hitler and the Nazis versus the Americans and D-Day and stuff like that is World War Three. So technically, we're getting close to World War Four. So, but that's just a technicality and a point of order. Your question is a very valid one. Who would be? I think the U.S. would have Israel. If the war is really going, if there was a world war that would involve the Middle East, Israel would obviously be an ally of the United States. And if you look at any world war, there are countries that are smaller that tend to help the bigger countries out. Bulgaria during World War One during the Second World War in the 1910s is an example of this. Obviously, Australia during World War Three is an example of this in the 1940s. But the truth of the matter is, the Europeans I think there'd be a lot of European support. I think Great Britain would probably help the United States. Canada probably would help the United States. I don't know about the French, but depends on how. But yes, you would have Russia, maybe China, Iran. China isn't exactly the biggest fans of Russia, and they see them as politically dangerous. But so did the Kaiser with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and look at what that led to. Um, Russia is weaker than China. It's not as strong as China, and it's not as strong as it continues to brag about. But if Russia were actually to create existential threats and invade NATO countries like Poland and Finland in their quest to control as much of Eastern Europe as they can, that would trigger the French and maybe even Germany to join the war. So at the most, you would have all of those, but I think you would have the Anglo world, United States, Canada, and Great Britain, probably with Israel. You would have the Japanese and the South Koreans fighting, because a lot of people believe that this will trigger North Korea invading South Korea. China would try to attack Taiwan, and this is just a theory about how it might look. And Russia would continue to would attack the eastern part of Europe, invade Poland. So Poland would obviously be in the war again. Sorry, Poland. Um, so the U.S. would have a number of allies, and then you would have basically this very strong axis again of all limited land, manpower, and resources with China, Russia, and Iran and North Korea. So um, T-Love, great question. Can't. By the way, British Empire is more like a Norman descended German empire. There was nothing British about the royal. Well, yeah, but that is what British is. Yes, the Normans conquered England. I mean, they did, and there were still English people. And by the 15th century, they all started to speak English. And yes, the Germans got in there with Victoria and the Hanoverian line starting in the 1700s. It's all very, very true, but there is definitely the family line can trace its way back to the Norman conquest. But the Normans were related to the English before the Anglo Saxons before that. So it is I understand that. English is obviously a language that is constructed from Latin and German, and native Celtic languages and things like that, and obviously French because of the Norman conquest and things like that. 60% of English words are technically French, or at least have a French origin. But did it accept Harry is saying, but did it accept certain claims such see got the choking spell going. But it did accept certain claims such as the British, Chilean, and other claims, but just said it couldn't be formally annexed and there couldn't be a permanent population there. That's true, but they did own British Guyana and areas like that in South America. Operation Paperclip. Trump said to go rally peacefully. By the way, I love your screen name because Operation Paperclip is the operation where at the end of World War III, the Americans took Nazi doctors, scientists, and researchers and brought them to the United States, granted them full immunity, basically pardoned them for all of their crimes against humanity and their sins against humans, and let them basically do experiments and do all sorts of stuff to help Americans create a national program, a more nuclear society. The space program was created by them. The V2 rocket, Werner von Braun, helped do that. But yes, so I love your name. It's a very historical handle, so thank you very much. Trump said to go to rally peacefully and orderly. FBI Ray refused to say how many undercover agents dressed as Trump supporters incited to violence. Yes, I've heard about this before, and there is some truth to that as well. Timothy Gills. How come there are no ancient civilizations south of the equator? Oh, there's plenty of ancient civilizations south of the equator. We don't have as much of a written record of them as we do about civilizations north of the equator, like the Greeks. We don't have much about the Celtics. We don't know how much about the Anglo-Saxons. We have a little bit, but we don't have written records like that. And you could compare it. The lack of resources, mainly primary sources being archaeological evidence and tools and things like that were found rather than written records. You could compare that to the Native Americans if you wished. So there are civilizations south of the equator. I mean, the Zulus were in Africa. The Bantu speaking peoples were migrating all over Africa for thousands of years, basically setting up different civilizations. And Bantu has become one of the most prevalent and predominant languages in sub-Saharan Africa, and it has shaped many different cultures and civilizations there. And that's south of the equator in many respects. So there were civilizations. You have the Maori people of that's not New Zealand. Those are the Aborigines. You have the Maori people of New Zealand. You do have a development of these civilizations. We just don't have as many written records about them as we did before, as we do other civilizations. So written records ensure the past more of an oral tradition, the preservation of records and histories, and you can build a cohesive historical narrative out of that. Whereas with archaeological evidence only, you have bits and pieces, and you have to make suppositions. So you need both an archaeological record and history along with a written history. And that's why history technically can't start until you have written records, which is why history doesn't technically begin until the Mesopotamians start doing that in ancient Sumer in the fifth millennium BC. So, yeah. No, it's all right. I've been called a walking encyclopedia, so in picking my mind, can't he's basic. Timothy is kind of reading a book. Operation Paperclip. Biden pardons Fauci. Yes, the preemptive pardon by President Biden has drawn a lot of controversy. He's not the only president to do preemptive pardons, and he's not the only president to pardon a family member. Abraham Lincoln pardoned his sister-in-law when her husband was a Confederate general in the Civil War. Either the ancient peoples were very clever, all the medieval people were very, very stupid, or not all. Sorry. Well, there's a lot of cleverness and then there's a lot of fluctuation. To assume that the medieval world was just full of darkness and decay and people weren't learning anything and nothing was getting done and people were just wild Vikings and barbarians is completely unfair and insensitive. That is basically like saying, once again, the Native Americans were complete savages who hadn't invented the wheel, so they meant nothing when the Europeans came and colonized them. Nobody would say that. So it's this tantamount to saying this. You have a breakdown of a centrifugal force and structure in the sense of the Roman Empire having such political control over Europe at that time, but you also have the development of you have a development of churches and monasteries which preserve ancient texts and writings. And yes, you find far more cohesion in the Abbasid Caliphate of the 9th and 10th centuries in the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East than you do in places like Europe and America at that time. But that doesn't mean that nothing was happening or nothing important mattered. Uh, by the way, King George, one of my favorite historical stories, King George III on July 4th, 1776, wrote in his diary, "Nothing important happened today." Boy, was he wrong, as I take a sip of coffee. So if you like what you're learning, if you like what I'm talking about, if you're enjoying the history that I'm discussing, please like and subscribe. And becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as that. Um, and all that good stuff. My social media handles are in the chat. M, would you mind putting them back in there, please? Surprised you don't have a question today. You always have such good questions. I'm saying the ancient peoples were clever and the medieval peoples were stupid. Yeah, well, the ancient peoples were able to find out a lot of things that was less structurally available during the medieval period, but it's not necessarily true. Cat. Rome was the peak of the human civilization. Rome was yes, there was a lot of benefits to living in Rome. You have the running water system of the aqueducts, you have a strong infrastructure with the creation of roads, all of that good stuff. But you also have brutality beyond your wildest dreams. You have gladiatorial combat and things like that that were eventually outlawed by the medieval church because it was considered to be so barbaric by the risingly more and more influential Christians. By the way, on my Substack, if you want to join there and read articles that I've written and stuff like that, I talk about this in great detail in my story about the history of St. Valentine's Day. So, King George supported the 13 colonies the majority of the way. It was Parliament running the country, not the king. The king had no tolerance for them revolting. He didn't have executive power anymore. By that time, the King of England was becoming more and more of a figurehead, but he obviously had no love for them rioting against him. He had no love for them condemning him in the Declaration of Independence, which, if you read the Declaration of Independence, you'll find that um, it's not just it's not just obviously we hold these truths to be self-evident and then saying that America is declaring its independence from Great Britain. There's an entire section, which is the longest section, that says what the king has done. He has done this and that. He has done that and this and that. And so the king was seen as the major political force in Great Britain still at that time. Nowadays, they would have identified Parliament, but the king was still seen as the head of Parliament and basically honoring Parliament's wishes, or Parliament was honoring his wishes. Yes, Parliament was passing these laws like the Townshend Acts, named after parliamentarian uh, Thomas Townshend. But the truth of the matter, or Charles Townshend, but the truth of the matter is that most of the parliaments most of the parliament had a lot of political power, but the king was still the representative head of the government, and was obviously not at all a fan of America gaining its independence and becoming its own country. So, now, obviously, no king wants to lose a tax base, which is a source of his income as well as a source of his power and prestige. And the Atlantic seaboard have been extremely reliable. And he didn't just lose the Atlantic seaboard; he lost most of what's now the Midwestern United States, areas they had just won from the French in that French Indian War, which is part of World War One. So if you've noticed anything I'm talking about, and if you've been listening, because I've been all over the place because people are asking about all sorts of different things, all of this history is connected to each other. History is a big tapestry, and all sorts of things happen at the same time. Well, yeah, Harry, that's true. There was definitely an overblowing of things like the Boston Massacre and things along that nature. The king understood where they were coming from, and he obviously had no ability to tax. And by the way, the American government was set up based on the British government, and that's why Congress has the ability to tax, not the president. So implementing tariffs is not constitutional. Just saying. But anyways, so you can do it temporarily, but it's going to run into legal issues and whatnot. But the truth of the matter is, yeah, the Americans were revolting not because they were being taxed too much and they were poor and destitute. The Indian colonies were being taxed significantly more and they were poor and destitute. The Americans revolted because they were being taxed without the ability to have a say in parliament. They had their own legislatures and things like that that already collected taxes from each colony and eventually sent a portion of that back to the British. But the British were now directly levying taxes without having a formal representative, a parliamentarian. So Wales had had people in parliament. There were Scottish members of parliament. There were Ireland. Yeah, Ireland was part of England at this time. Ireland wasn't united with Great Britain at this time, but it had its own parliament. It wasn't united until I think 1810. But basically, the British had all of these other constituent parts of their growing empire receiving representation, but America not so much. So I understand why he sympathized, but he didn't want to lose his land, his power, and his prestige, and his wealth. Actually, they know that brutality was the main force to keep people under control. Gladiator fights just like football today's world. Yes, it is. And truth be told, forms of sports entertainment and things along that nature are actually redefinitions and reinterpretations and reapplications of warfare. And it releases the same amount of testosterone and things like that, and it's a way for testosterone, usually by men, to be sharpened against each other without with some threats of violence, but no threat of mortal violence, usually through the ways that warfare is. So de- it's a um, it's a de-intensified, um, defanged form of warfare. And you have two teams, you have competition, you have rivalries. It just shows how human societies have, you could say, evolved to the point where they don't need constant bloodshed and violence in front of them to be entertained. But we were only levying taxes because we had just spent 60 million pounds defending them. Yes, Harry, I understand where you're coming from as a Brit, and I have so much respect for the Brit. One of my great moderators, Simon the Bunny, is a Brit. I have many people who follow this channel from the UK. I've done an entire series on the Kings of England, and stuff like that. So I know exactly what you're, and the monarchs, I should say, because you got great queens like Victoria, Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth II. But the truth of the matter is, I completely agree with you. It was levying taxes to pay for a war that had been spent defending that land. So the British had this view of, why you are a child, you have no right to be speaking for yourself. Yeah, and that's a huge amount of money for back then. So the taxes that they inflicted on the British themselves, their own citizenry, and on the Indians were significantly higher. So they didn't understand why the Americans were complaining. The Americans had this thing called salutary neglect, where basically the British had left the colonies alone to have their own economic and social independence, while paying loyalty, fealty, and some taxes to the British Crown. And salutary neglect had given the colonies their own feelings of semi autonomy that had lasted for 150 years. So the Americans in their revolution went from self government of one form to self government of another form, just without an ultimate authority, the ultimate authority being the US Constitution instead of the British King. Um, yeah, can. Oh, yeah. Very nice to meet you as well, Khan. Isn't that an emperor? Or isn't that a Byzantine emperor you just referenced? It was minimal taxes. It wasn't the rate. It was never the rate that bothered the Americans. It was the levying of the taxes without their consent. They felt that they had no choice in the matter and that they needed a choice in the matter in their own taxation. Yeah, they would govern themselves like the Falkland Islands and the current British overseas territories. Yeah, that's true. What current British territories are overseas other than the Falkland Islands? That's interesting. Oh, interesting. That's fascinating. If you've just joined us, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel where we talk all things about history, social studies, and the like in a friendly neighborhood manner. We are going for 2 hours today. We are almost through of our first hour where I've been answering questions and taking feedback, comments, and topics about history and social studies. And I think we'll go for about an hour and a half, and then we'll transition into the lecture period where I'll be talking about the American presidents, and in lieu of tomorrow's holiday here in the States, President's Day. And yes, I am an American. It's probably not hard to figure out from my accent and demeanor, but I do my absolute best to learn as much history about different areas of the world as possible. In the last couple of years, I've gotten more into Eastern histories. I'm doing a current series on Chinese imperial dynasties, and there's a lot of fascinating knowledge and information there. So please consider liking and subscribing. And you've got the social media handles there, including my Patreon, where I do more bonus content, including a series on the First Ladies. I also have my Substack where you can read my articles. And there's Instagram, Facebook, and the like. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, or you want to have a talk with me and explain why I'm wrong, which is perfectly fine to do, join me, email me at friendlyneighborhoodhistory1@gmail.com. T-Love, how is Saudi Arabia able to stay out of major disagreements? They aren't. The truth of the matter is, most of the major disagreements that are happening in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia is either directly or indirectly involved in them. And a lot of the issues with oil and OPEC stem from Saudi Arabia's municipal control over it. And part of the reason that Saudi Arabia has been seen as friendly by the West is because the British allowed the Saud family to take over Arabia in the 1930s, granted that there would be contracting for oil, and kind of a post-colonial relationship has developed where the Western world looks at Saudi Arabia and sees oil and doesn't, and but also sees obviously the repression and the Wahhab Islam, which is what we normally call radical Islam, that has engulfed that region. Respectfully, if I had just given someone £10,000 to buy a car to run away and implanted a £100 fee a week to get the money back, if I was the person given the money, I wouldn't complain. Yeah, but the Americans didn't see it that way. And the Americans themselves had fought and died in the French and Indian War, and they were the ones who were in existential danger of the French and the Indians. It wasn't like they just watched British regulars fight. I mean, George Washington and many other American officers during the American Revolution cut their teeth in the 7 Years' War, in the French Indian War. So, where is the Diogenes from? Trying to remember what that is. I don't know everything off the top of my head. I think that's Greek, ancient Greek. Doge discovering USA spending abroad for other countries' people. Isn't that taxation minus the representation while US infrastructure is crumbling? Yeah, there is definitely issues about US infrastructure, and I understand and sympathize with a lot of what you're saying. Basically, the idea is the taxes that the US pays, the money that the government gets, it gets from taxes, usually income taxes, and there are other forms of taxes as well. Actually, there's dozens of forms of taxes, and that money is then used by the government for means that they think is best. Something that I have heard recently that I think would be a capital idea and a really good one is that the government create a budget, and actually not just an internal budget that Congress passes every year, but a budget released to the American people that shows how tax dollars are paid. Now, it would create a lot of messy paperwork for me to get an individualized statement saying 5% of your taxes went to funding this and 5% went to funding that. But just a general idea of what we're going to spend it on and what American tax dollars are coming from through the general fund of taxes would make it possible, would make it far more transparent form of government. But technically speaking, that isn't taxation without representation, Operation Paperclip, because the USAID and these other programs are established by the executive branch, um, and are approved of by Congress, and the Congress passes laws regarding taxation and the use of federal money to do things like foreign aid. So, Bermuda, Cayman Islands, British Indian Ocean Territory, St. Helena, South Georgia, and the Sandwich Islands, and although not in nationally recognized, the British Antarctic territories. That's interesting. So they do have some territories left over because the empire has definitely diminished. If we haven't noticed, and I've been talking a lot about the British Empire here. So yeah, and I didn't know. I thought I recall that Bermuda was still in control. I'm surprised the Cayman and Sandwich Islands are still controlled by the British. I imagine there's some form of autonomy, maybe even autonomous government there, like they have in Northern Ireland and Scotland. So, anyways, I take a sip of my coffee. Hopefully, you're snuggling up to a late afternoon uh, live stream where you can listen to some good history talked about, and hopefully that live stream is indeed mine. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate everyone here and the conversations we're having. A smaller crowd today, but an enjoyable one with a lot of great topics. So if you have a topic, a question, or a comment about history, please be sure to ask us. Ali from Turkey. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I love Turkey, such a fascinating country. I love my coffee, as you can notice here, and I love the Turkish coffee they have that is so strong that it sticks to your teeth. And one of my goals in life is to try that and then peel it off my teeth. T Love, could you discuss the time of the Ming Dynasty and what was happening in the West at that time? So the Ming Dynasty lasts from the late 14th century to the mid 17th century, and the Ming were had invaded China. They were Manchurians who overthrew Manchus, where the name Manchurian comes from. They were the Manchus tribe, and they overthrew the Yuan dynasty. And the Yuan dynasty were also invaders, Mongolians, and the Ming dynasty ruled over China for the next few centuries. And the Ming dynasty, or do I even have that right? Yes, it is. And then the Qing dynasty overthrew them, and those were native Chinese. There's a lot of foreign invaders and native dynasties in Chinese imperial history all throughout their time, actually. But the Ming dynasty basically is in many ways the Chinese golden age. That is where China flourished in the arts, mathematics, science, and technology. Most of the technology that is taken for granted as Western is actually Chinese. The astrolabe and the compass and the magnetic compass, these things that were used to help the explorers come from to the New World and settle there were originally Chinese in origin. The Chinese have an extremely strong economy during the Ming Dynasty, and the way they get this is through the treasure fleets of the early 15th century. A man named Zheng He, under the command of the Ming Emperor, basically built a large flotilla of naval ships and trade ships and went to different islands and lands, extracting resources and money from them, usually in Oceania. Now, this made China extraordinarily wealthy and made basically a bunch of client states. And basically, the Ming Dynasty wasn't just a Chinese empire; it was an East Asian empire that had a huge, excuse me, a huge sphere of influence over Eastern and Southeastern Asia and the lands of Polynesia, Macaronesia, and Oceania. If they had kept going, they may have very well landed in the New World and colonized it long before the Europeans, yet these were eventually suspended in the 1430s. But they had made the Ming Dynasty extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily wealthy. And while they are not known for their military prowess like other Chinese dynasties, they are known for their inventions. One of the most famous of them is the abacus. So, um, that was the Ming Dynasty abacus, the use of porcelain, which was already used before to create beautiful um, cookware, silverware, vases, pottery, which was so nice that it was literally called the fine china. So that's why you call something fine china, because the Chinese are the ones who majored in it um, uh, using what's it called? Using porcelain. So, and yes, they were using gunpowder. The Chinese were using gunpowder in their fighting long before the Ming Dynasty and during the Ming Dynasty. And it was around this time that the Europeans, using their trade and their resources that they acquired through China, usually through using the Silk Road that went from the Middle East to China, or through going through India, which is what Columbus was trying to do when he first came to the New World, was able to access resources, technology, and things like gunpowder that they were able to perfect. So, um, who had the most impressive golden age? I think the Chinese had many golden ages. If I were to pick a Chinese imperial dynasty that was most powerful, I would say probably the Han Dynasty, since that's what I was talking about. I think the Pax Romana is extraordinarily impressive. How the Romans held all of these fighting tribes at bay, continued to expand their influence and power and wealth, and that was when they were ruled by pretty good rulers for the most part. Although they had some bad eggs in there as well. Um, yeah, there's so that Timex. I would say that. Um, Harry, we have 14 overall, the 12 that have people on them all the full self government, with Britain just controlling foreign policy and military policy. That's interesting. So there's a level of semi autonomy. Britain has done that many times where they've controlled military and foreign policy. They did it with Afghanistan in the late 19th century. My master's thesis was actually about the Great Game, in which Britain tried to take over Afghanistan just so they could stop the Russians from becoming too influential. I already answered T Love about the Ming Dynasty. Ali, do you think the Armenian genocide real or just propaganda? Real. Absolutely real. You have a displacement of millions of people who are not accounted for, and is the first major genocide of the 20th century. And believe me, there would be more. Um, yeah, the number, it could be 500,000. It could be up to 2 million. Sup, Running Man? Um, yeah, sorry about that. That static's probably coming from me adjusting my seating position. Is the static still there? Hopefully, I'm coming in clear now. But anyways, um, yeah. So actually, I've caught up to the chat and I've answered all the questions. So let's see. Does anyone have any other questions or comments or topics they would like to discuss? If not, I can get into my discussion of President's Day and things like that. I'm going to take another sip of coffee. By the way, tomorrow's special live stream will be probably another Q&A to make up for missing my Q&As. I'm making them up today and tomorrow. And join us. That will be at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It looks like tomorrow, and I will be answering your questions for another hour, history topics and stuff like that. Meaning of life. Oh boy, liking and subscribing to this channel. So tomorrow I'm doing a live stream for an hour where I'll be answering all your questions, and then I'll be releasing a longer video about President's Day and its history and why Americans celebrate it and all of that stuff, and the office of the presidency, doing a little description there. And at the same time, I'm also doing next weekend. This was supposed to be this weekend, but family emergencies have kind of pushed this back. Next weekend, I am doing an entire. I'm doing a series, not a series, but I'm doing more live streams, including a 2-hour Friday night Q&A, which is twice as long as my normal Q&As on Friday nights, where I will be answering all your questions related to history as we celebrate the year anniversary of the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Again, it's supposed to be this weekend, pushed it back to next weekend, and it's still all good. Join us for that. It'll be a lot of fun. So, uh, let me see. I was thinking about Japan defending all these years. Yeah, the Japanese were extraordinarily good at defending themselves, especially from the Chinese, and the defeat of the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty, off the coast of Japan, one by a typhoon, and another one just by brutalizing the shores of Japan and just killing as many Chinese, Mongolian invaders as possible. The Japanese were extraordinarily formidable in making sure that they were never colonized and always keeping a leery eye of foreigners. That is why the European Christians who actually went and set up settlements there under the Portuguese in the late 16th century were later all killed during the Tokugawa shogunate, which is the inspiration for James Clavell's Shogun, which is obviously the famous TV miniseries on Hulu now. So, I was thinking about which president would win in a Royal Rumble. Well, there's no question about it. Teddy Roosevelt uh, would defeat every other president when it came to a boxing match. Lincoln and Roosevelt, two of the best American presidents, would be two of the best American fighters. Uh, Lincoln, um, Lincoln, sorry, I'm blanking for a second. Um, Lincoln was undefeated as a wrestler. Yes, he was tall and wiry and very thin and not very good looking, but he was extraordinarily good at fighting and loved to use an axe and loved to wrestle. And Teddy Roosevelt, another great American president in so many ways, was also very good at fighting. He was a very sickly child, and in order to become as good as he possibly could, in order to overcome his early sicknesses and things like that, he became a boxer. Interestingly enough, and he was very good at boxing. So, what do you think of the British Empire compared to other European empires of the time? Obviously, a little bit bigger, but the British did not have as much interest in European affairs during the 19th century, and were far more interested in colony building in places like India and Australia. Germany, as soon as it became an empire under the Prussians in the 1870s, had the largest amount of land and resources in Central and Western Europe, and obviously intimidated the French Republic. The French Empire was based on its strong connections to northwestern Africa that were forged with the conquest of areas like Tunis and Algeria in the 1830s, and then the development of French Western Africa, which included modern day countries such as Morocco and Mali. Also, the French took over Indochina, southeastern Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which were taken over by the Japanese during World War II, or should I say World War III, and they were overthrown by Vietnamese freedom fighters and a man named Ho Chi Minh, who immediately demanded independence for the Indo-Chinese people from the French, which led, of course, to the Vietnam War. Um, so the other empires were doing their own things, and the Russians just have a huge amount of land. Anyways, they are the largest country on earth, so at that time they were technically larger than the British, but they didn't have nearly as much influence um, and say so and spread as the rest of the countries in Europe, and they were actually technologically backwards compared to the other European countries. Yep. The Japanese are extraordinarily good at military power, and every time they've been challenged, they fought back. They felt that the Christian immigrants were challenging them, and the Jesuits were challenging them, and the Portuguese were challenging them. So they barred all foreigners except the Dutch and banned Roman Catholicism in the 1600s. Then in the 1850s, Commodore Matthew Perry was sent by the Americans, landed there, and basically demanded Japan open up its doors for trade or else. And seeing the ironclad warships and seeing the modern militaries that they had only heard about, the Japanese decided to eventually overthrow the old Tokugawa shogunate, which, like many empires, was once great and mighty, but had now become corrupt and bloated and inflated, which happens all the time. The British, so the British, the Americans, the French, they all swooped in to trade with Japan, and under the Emperor Meiji, who the emperor in Japan didn't ever have huge amounts of political power. There still is an emperor in Japan. Arahito is his name, but they do have the ability to once in a while step in and basically say how things are going to be. So the Emperor Meiji called for restoration and industrialization and basically Japan catching up to the West, which started in 1868. And by the early 1900s, Japan was so good they were able to defeat Russia in a war, and then they fought in World War II and World War III and were extraordinarily formidable. So Japan has been really fascinating. Timex, you're so nice. Awesome channel, bro. That is the pinned comment of the day. You are an awesome listener. Thank you for your support. It means a lot. Um, what do you think of socialized healthcare? Well, Harry, it's very common in Western Europe, and it basically develops as part of social reform. There's this progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th century which says the government should be more involved in people's lives and allow them to have and be a force for social change and provide them with certain things like unemployment insurance, um, strengthening the banks, and provide them with healthcare. And that healthcare is a human right, and that if you don't have healthcare, you die, just like food, clothing, and shelter. Therefore, the government should be able to provide it to people. So the British government, start under the NIH after World War II, basically made sure that socialized medicine would be the way it would go. It's the way in Canada and throughout most of Western Europe. The United States is one of the most developed countries in the world that doesn't have it. So, um, let me see here. I'm just giving you a little history on it. I'm not going to get into the politics of it. I try to be as objective as possible when I talk about all of these different things. In no way to follow it. I've been following your channel for a few months now. Very informative, and I appreciate it. No way affiliated. I'm glad that you're affiliated with us. Thank you so much. Has there ever been a country even close to the USA in terms of freedom of people, etc.? How did it turn out? I think the British had a lot of freedom. I think America got a lot of its ideas from the British in terms of freedom, of the different freedoms like freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Those are modern inventions that really become hyper popularized by a movement called the Enlightenment in the 1700s. But the French and the British have been close in terms of providing as much freedoms for their people as much as they possibly can. Um, Hugh Hefner's Smoke Jacket Man is it. It is I, Al Pepe. We have returned. Could you do a vid on Korea's world largest consecutive run with slavery? Yes, I just read about that the other day, El Pepe, that actually the Koreans have the longest history with slavery. Yes, and I believe, and they didn't get rid of it until very late in their society, and they've had it for thousands of years. Korea is extremely fascinating, especially as it's had to play off the two large empires next to it. Obviously, is huge with population and even land space, and Japan has a lot of power and influence. And Korea has kind of been able to play off both of them and fight against both of them and maintain some form of independence in the medieval period. This was the kingdom of Koryo. In the modern state, you have the creation of North Korea, which is highly influenced by the Soviets and the People's Republic of China. And you have South Korea, which has been highly formed by the United States and democratic Japan, which emerged after World War III. So yes, and I would love to do a video on that. And yes, the Smoking Jacket Man, the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. I'm not the Friendly Neighborhood historian. If you like and subscribe, you're a Friendly Neighborhood historian. That's how it works. Did you study history in university? Well, in a very British way, I read history in university, yes, and I got my master's in history just last fall. Um, Timex, they believed banned Catholicism because of foreigners or because of the system of Catholic itself. Both. Obviously, the Jesuits had a lot of influence in their fingers in way too many pies at that time, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Jesuits, and there's a lot of mutual hatred between the Jesuits and other Catholic fraternal orders and societies of the religious, as they are called, such as the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and stuff like that. The truth of the matter is that the Jesuits were extraordinarily politically motivated as well as economically motivated, but they were also, of course, religiously motivated for what they called the salvation of souls. And the Catholic and by bringing the Catholic faith to the Japanese islands, what they were also doing is bringing Portuguese and Catholic influences, and the Japanese were extraordinarily worried about this and seeing the foreigners as a corrosive force to ruin the old way, the samurai system, and the feudal structure that Japan had, where you had the shogun, the premier warlord at the top, surrounded by all of his constituent warlords called daimyos. Then you had their knights, their vassals, who would lead their armies called samurai. Yes, samurai are the Japanese equivalents of medieval knights. And then underneath them, you have a group of you have merchants and peasants who are very peasants are very important. Farming is very important because Japan doesn't have a lot of farmland. Um, Yes, that they saw the Catholics as a threat to their social structures and things like that. So, um, so they believe that Catholicism was corrosive. They didn't like the idea of Christianity. Obviously, Buddhism was extraordinarily popular in Japan. It had come to Japan from China, and also the worship of kamis or spirits, like the emperor himself, was very common for the Japanese. And so, belief in multiple deities and multiple all-powerful spirits was not uncommon. So many of the Japanese embracing a monotheistic religion from the West made them very, very afraid of whites. And who knows how much colonization would have occurred had that continued, just like the Portuguese colonized Brazil and the Spanish colonized South and Central America, and of course the English and the Americans colonized North America. So, um, you, Let me see here. Harry's asking, did you enjoy university? I really did. I love learning. I love the ability to be in a place surrounded by people who were passionate about it and learning about it because they wanted to, not just because they had to. And I had always loved history, so it was easy for me to familiarize myself into that environment. But I've been studying this stuff for 20 years, which isn't saying much because I was studying it when I was a little kid and I was loving it back then. So social studies have always been my passion. They've been my saving grace. I shared earlier, I've been going for a really difficult time recently, and I mean, you had the forced relocation, you had me setting up my new studio, you had all of this stuff, and things have not been pleasant. But I've always done the live streams, I've always done the channel, I've always done my videos and stuff, and those keep me going because I'm able to share and disseminate a lot of information with very, very nice and helpful people who do a lot of really good, like you, Harry. So the truth of the matter is, I really enjoy any environment in which I'm able to share my knowledge and learn from other people. And this channel is where I learn from other people because people bringing different views and opinions or introducing topics I've not heard about, they get me to the drawing board. They help me learn more, and the more I learn, the more I'm amazed by what I learn about human beings. Um, so you're debating whether to do that for political science or that of philosophy. I studied both of those a little bit in college, not nearly as much, but they're obviously, as I say all the time, if you're going to learn history, you're going to have to learn politics, you're going to have to learn economics, you're going to have to learn philosophy, and you're going to have to learn religion. Whether you like these things or not, you're going to want to learn them as they are nice subsidiaries and associates to history. They're close friends of history. So if you want to go over to history's house and have a beer, you're going to have to have a beer with political science, religion, and philosophy. It's just how it is because history is about ideas. It's what motivates people to do things. Ever go down conspiracy alley? For example, after World War II, apparently the Nazis went to Argentina. And you feel on that. Well, that's not a conspiracy theory. There's actually truth to the matter. Now, the idea that all Italians and German people of Argentinian descent or all Argentinians of German and Italian descent are Nazis is not true. The real truth of the matter is that Argentina was highly populated by Italians and Germans who had migrated there in the late 19th century, just like they've been migrating to the United States. Not as in large numbers, but about 1 million Italians migrated to Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries before there ever was a Benito Mussolini, at least running Italy for that matter. So that was happening. Italy was a really struggling and stratified society with a lot of economic backwardness, and so they um, they a lot of Italians wanted to find new life, and they didn't necessarily want to find it in the crowded slums of Manhattan. So a lot of them went to Argentina. Same thing with Germans who were already migrating in the early part of the 19th century. So Argentina became a place for migration. There are many Italian surnames that are actually German or Italian, or German or Italian surnames that are actually of Argentinian ethnicity or ancestry. And so there were a lot of Nazis who went to Argentina after World War II, or sorry, World War III. And they settled there and created their own little societies. Um, there were Nazis who were able to escape there. Joseph Mengele escaped there and lived there for the rest of his life. Adolf Eichmann escaped there, and the Mossad, the Jewish CIA, basically Israeli CIA, tracked him down and found him in 1960. And the movie Operation it was Oscar Isaac, the guy from Star Wars. Operation Finale. Yeah, Operation Finale shows how Eichmann was hunted down and how the Nazis escaped. So it's not a conspiracy theory to say there were some Nazis who made it to South America. There definitely were. And Argentina had some sympathies. You have Perón and other right wing leaders who are at least sympathetic to the Nazi cause in some ways. Um, Thank you, Harry. Yeah, my life is improving because I'm doing stuff like this. And this is how, and even when life really sucks and things are really hard, finding and doing what you love just brings you so much fulfillment and joy. Operation Finale, Oscar Isaac, Nick Kroll, very, very good movie. I think it came out like 6 or 7 years ago. And Sir Ben Kingsley, who interestingly enough was in probably my favorite historical movie, Schindler's List, also plays Adolf Eichmann. So he went from playing a Jew trying to escape the Holocaust in Schindler's List, another fantastic movie, to basically playing a Nazi who killed thousands of Jews. These are real people, these are real events, and they're very, very fascinating. And telling them through the lens of movies can sometimes really distort them, but they can sometimes really shed a light and introduce people who wouldn't otherwise be introduced to it. So, what do I think of monarchy? Well, I think that monarchy. I was talking about this at the beginning of a live stream, but basically, monarchy is um, monarchy is basically the a system. It's a hierarchical system of authoritarianism that is created based on family structures and ultra patriotism. And basically, this idea that one time there was a great tribal leader of our people who was so good that he decided to set his family in charge. And it didn't matter if his son was good or bad, but he was so good that we follow him because obviously the gods or God put him in charge and has put his family in charge as a result. And that's why throughout European history, you have this conflict between church and state, you have this conflict between parliament and king over what's called the divine right, where basically the kings of medieval Europe would say, God put me in this role, so therefore what I'm doing is God's will, and you must submit. And Parliament eventually says that's absurd. Um, so, so I think it's extremely traditional. It's interesting to see that monarchy basically tends in the modern world toward less and less power, and authoritarianism, dictatorship, basically where it says to heck with any idea of familial ties or heritage. We're going to be empowered because we are in power. So what do you think? Do you have any pets? I recently lost my cat. So yeah, when it rains, it pours. In no way affiliated, but I lost my cat. I love cats. I'm very much a cat guy. Um, T-Love, did you watch Rome on HBO? So do you think they did a decent job? I watched some of it. It was okay. I mean, gratuitous violence, sexual scenes, things like this are just going to get attention. The fan service on things like this is sometimes kind of extraordinary. I mean, as best as HBO can, I'm not expecting much when I see HBO presents the Roman Empire, just like I'm not going to expect much when I see Ridley Scott presents Napoleon. Um, yeah. Dublin, the clans. Are you referring to Ireland or Scotland? Also good to see you. Yeah, it's been a rough patch for me right now, but I'm doing the best I possibly can. It's always funny when I watch something historical that I personally know a lot about and criticize my family. Always goes nuts and say, "Just watch the film and shut up." I'm a victim of that too. I'm a perpetrator of that too, and I'll sometimes just have us pause it and I'll say, "Well, that actually isn't what happened," and stuff like that. But I don't get angry. I don't get over passionate because I'm just learning to accept that whatever medium people are introduced to history, even through popular history, is good. Total misconceptions, like basically changing huge significant events, are going to draw ire from me. I'm far more obsessive with books, and if you have an entertaining book and it's adapted into a movie series and it's not a good movie series, then why it's not accurate to the book, then it's a waste of time in my opinion because the book is entertaining, so the movie should be entertaining and loyal as much as it can be to the source material. So yeah, the clans are extraordinarily important in both Ireland and history, Irish and Scottish history. Um, Clans establish tribes, and those eventually establish nation. But basically, the English felt both in Ireland and Scotland that clanship was stupid, and that that monarchy and structure should supersede um, hi, ancient tribal and clan ties and things like that. So. Anyways, we've been going for about 82 minutes. Does anyone have any more questions or topics they would like to discuss? I'm going to shift the attention to the lecture, and this probably shouldn't take more than 15 minutes or so as I talk about President's Day. Um, yeah, I would, Harry. That's an interesting one. So we haven't talked about the Roman Empire too much today, but again, we have already spoken about this. But Julius Caesar was definitely more of an emperor than Octavian. So Harry, I don't fully agree because I don't think that I think Octavian obviously held the title and was able to assume more and more power. What Julius could not do by force and swiftness, Octavian did through his shrewdness and subtlety and over time. And over time, as he went through his life, Octavian, later Augustus, basically allowed the Senate, allowed the government to make him the emperor and to recognize his imperial status and would live life humbly, live in a small home, not dress in fancy clothes. He did all of these things because he was really, really hell bent on basically making Rome as making his power as subtle and creeping as possible because he had seen his uncle and the swiftness with which he had tried to force the Romans to accept him as their ruler, stab him in the back, literally. And so he was much more um, uh, incremental in the way that he seized and took power. But basically, the Senate calling him Augustus, which means revered one, which is not his name, calling him imperator, these terms being bestowed upon him, Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder. These are terms that the Roman Senate gave to Augustus because he was willing to basically play the game and act like he wasn't power hungry when he was probably the most power hungry person in history up to that point. And so, what Julius could not do through brutality, Augustus did through subtlety. So, anyways, but yeah, I love the Roman Empire. I have a series on the Roman emperors, and I do a video on, and I did a video on Julius Caesar to start that series out, and I did a long form video on Augustus Harry. So go check those out when you get the chance. If you want to learn more about that, I should organize that into a playlist. I've got a playlist for the U.S. presidents, the Russian czars, the English monarchs, and my political commentary, where I commented on the 2024 election. From a historian's perspective, when I saw it was going to be a historic election, I realized that I needed to talk about the U.S. presidential election in those terms. Um, but I need to compile my Roman Emperors series into a proper playlist so people can easily access it. I've also I also have a playlist where I narrate the Christmas Carol, since I did a little bit of history on that and the history of Christmas itself, for some short and long form content as well. So please check out the short and long form content after the live stream when you get a chance, whenever it's convenient for you. Um, Caesar was much more popular and legally held more power, and Caesar was much more forgiving. Caesar was forgiving, but Octavian was forgiving too. Octavian was very swift and brutal when he had to be, like with Lepidus and Antony, but he was also very capable of playing the long game. And I don't think that Julius Caesar played the long game that well. And I think he was kind of swallowed up in his own hubris, and that's why he ended up getting killed. I don't think Augustus would have ever been killed by senators because of that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Octavian did not. I'm not saying Octavian was a good dude. I'm saying Octavian was a very subtle and shrewd person, and maybe even more dangerous than Julius Caesar in some of those ways, because Julius was a military man and kind of this straightforward guy, but he wasn't the most politically savvy bloke in the world. He was, by the way, speaking of England and the UK here, he was the first Roman to claim the UK for the Romans, and it was the Emperor Claudius who later went in and conquered it. But interestingly enough, Dublin, you brought up the clanship of Ireland and Scotland. The clanship, first of all, the Romans did not want to go into Hibernia, as it was called, and conquer it because it was another island. But the clanship of Scotland kept the English from properly conquering it, because the clans would flee, the tribes would flee up into the highlands, and the Romans could never really wipe them all out or subjugate or enslave them. So because of that, time and time again, they went into Scotland, and time again, they had to withdraw from Scotland. They could never conquer Scotland, which is why Scotland, I think, is a distinct entity from England to this day. Um, and they never even messed around with Ireland. It was the Catholic Church that conquered Ireland for the Western world, if you want to think about it that way, through St. Patrick's Day, through St. Patrick, whose day we'll be celebrating in a month, and who there'll be a video about. I have a video on St. Patrick, on St. Valentine's, and I have an article on that on my Substack. So, if you want to put the Substack in there for them to check out. Does the Italian mob control a lot of Italy? I was actually listening to a story. I love creepy stories and stuff like that, and I listen to them a lot. And the narrators are so good. On channels like Let's Read and Lazy Masquerade. But the mob does have a the mafia influence has deteriorated. The stereotypical Goodfellas Godfather like mafia in the United States has depreciated in its structure and traditionalism, over the last few decades, and it's common for immigrant groups in the United States to form, either to work their tails off to gain it through legal means, or to capitalize on the social system, and through illicit means create crime empires like the Italian mafia, which flourished during Prohibition when alcohol was in high demand but also highly illegal. But there was Irish mafia, there was the Tong, the Chinese mafia, and many immigrant groups have had mafias. And Tren Agua and the cartels are just the newest example of this. An immigrant group with one group with one part of it that's more shady, and of course doesn't change the fact that native people commit crimes all the time and have gangs and have all sorts of horrible things. So the Italian mob, the mafia in Italy itself, is far more robust and far more influential and powerful than it is in the United States, and it's far more still structured and organized. Yes, that is true. I don't know to what extent, but from what I have read, that is still true. So Lepidus was never stripped of the title Pontifex. I don't know why though. Yeah, basically, Octavian bought him out. He basically said, "Here's a lot of money. Don't get in my way," and was able to seize the North African portion of for the Romans. So that's how Octavian was able to basically get enough resources and land and the approval of the Senate to basically condemn Mark Antony and Cleopatra and then execute them. So, um, we are going to move into the lecture portion, and this shouldn't take me too long, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about. This was I was gonna usually Sunday afternoons, 4 p.m. Eastern is when I do my live stream lecture where I talk about different historical topics with different historical people, with different historical things, and I go on for an hour about that. But Yeah, Fridays and Saturdays is usually when I actually have a live stream lecture and I have questions and answering and all of that fun stuff. But Sundays is when I do my lectures and talk about different historical topics. So obviously, with President's Day, with a lot of people in the United States having a 3-day weekend, I was just going to talk a little bit about the history of that to wrap up today's live stream. So we might end a little bit. Thank you so much. In no way affiliated. I'm glad you're here. Um, at least Anthony and Cleopatra got what they deserved. Did they deserve that? I don't know if they deserve that. I don't know if they deserve suicide and letting a snake bite her in the breast and die. St. Patrick was a slave captured by Irish raiders in Wales. Yes, he was. And then he became a Catholic bishop and missionary who fought against the Druidic pagan groups that had a huge influence over the Celtic tribes that had been in Ireland for centuries, and started to Christianize and colonize the island religiously. So, but interestingly enough, I'm going to be talking about President's Day, which is obviously tomorrow, and why Americans have a 3-day holiday, and why Americans have such love for the presidency. Technically speaking, the U.S. Constitution, written in the late 1780s, stipulates that the president is second in terms of power. The founders wanted Congress to have most of the power. The president was there to run the army, which is basically structured because George Washington was the obvious first president of the United States, and the Congress basically sets it up where Congress will make all the laws, Congress will hold the power of the purse, Congress will pass taxes, and Congress will have debates back and forth. And it has two chambers so that things are not passed too quickly and government does not grow too powerful. This was the fear of the founders that government would become powerful, encroaching, and corrupt, like they felt the British government was at that time. Their fear was creating a government that was too strong, even though they had experiments with governments that were too weak, like the Articles of Confederation. The president was supposed to get swift action passed. He's supposed to get things done swiftly for the American populace, and that's why George Washington was set up in that style. That's why the president is the commander in chief, because Washington had been the commander in chief of the American Revolutionary Forces 15 years prior. So the American system basically calls for Congress to be the most powerful, with the president being second. He's supposed to execute the law. He's supposed to enforce what Congress has already passed and bring those laws to fruition. However, as time has gone on, the president's power has fluctuated. But in the last about century, the United century, 125 years, ever since a man named Teddy Roosevelt became president in the early 1900s, the power of the presidency has exponentially increased, with only a few presidents here and there kind of diminishing its power and deferring more to Congress and the courts. The U.S. president now, many people see as almost as the premier executive, similar to basically a demagogue who can basically do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and make laws without exemption. Now, the Supreme Court and other courts are able to step in and stop the president's executive orders or ideas from taking shape, but the president has enough political power that if his party controls Congress, which Donald Trump is an example right now, his party controls Congress, he basically feels that he can get and do what he wants. Courts can block his ideas, and Congress can block his ideas too, and things like that. So the president usually will recommend laws, and if he thinks that he's not getting the laws that he wants, he can make an executive order. And an executive order is doing something, um, is making a rule for everyone to follow. And it's basically like a law, and it can be temporary or it can be meant to be indefinite or permanent. And it can be challenged by the courts and ruled as unconstitutional and overturned. The founders set up a system where Congress, the president, and the courts all kind of work with each other and they check and balance each other. But as time has gone on, the president has become more and more impactful and more powerful in American history and has relied on things like executive orders to control the narrative and to control policy. He also has the ability to recommend laws to Congress, and if his party is in control, can basically get what he wants to some extent. And because of this, the president, because he signs laws and recommends laws and pushes for laws and advocates for laws, has used that power to gain to get what he wants. And so the presidential office has gained more power as time goes on. Another reason the president has become more important and influential for the Americans is because the president has the ability to create the executive bureaucracy. So, from a few small departments set up originally by George Washington, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, these advisors who would basically help him run the government, we have ballooned in the United States to having a much larger bureaucracy that includes different departments that have different organizations under them, like the IRS is part of a Treasury Department, and the EPA is part of the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency. So The president's power has increased as more as the federal bureaucracy has increased, as the ability to make executive orders has increased, and as America has become more politically divided, meaning that a president relies on his political party to have all the power in Congress so that he can get his agenda passed. And as America has become more politically polarized between the Democratic and Republican parties, the president relies on that party to basically get what he wants, rather than having bipartisanship and compromise, which was far more the case in earlier American history. Although political division in America is not as bad as it was, say, during the Civil War, it's pretty formidable right now, with both sides basically thinking the other are morally bankrupt and evil. Um, so the president has increased in his power and prestige and in his ability to do things. And as he has done this, he has become more and more of a celebrity and more of a famous figure and more of a recognizable figure. Early presidents were actually able to be accessed. You could walk to the White House when the country was very small and meet them and actually shake their hands and talk to them. After William McKinley was shot in 1901, this became almost impossible to do, as presidents eventually got Secret Service, which is part of a Treasury Department, to protect them at all times. That was established in the 1920s. But before then, people could meet presidents pretty often, pretty easily. And presidents sometimes hosted large, lavish parties where people could come to the White House and meet them. Um, so the American president did have some level of celebrity, but with the advent of more political power, a larger federal bureaucracy, political division, and of course, America becoming more prominent on the world stage, and the new mediums of radio, film, and television showing the president more, giving more access to the life and activities of a U.S. president and his family, the first lady, and others involved. The president has become more and more powerful and more of a celebrity and more important. This has led Americans to want to celebrate their presidents. And so President's Day is a celebration not just of America's current president, but of all of the presidents, more or less, even though some of them were downright awful. Take the case of James Buchanan, whose inactivity at the end of the 1850s basically caused the Civil War. President's Day technically celebrates James Buchanan. Um, there are some presidents that don't really deserve to be celebrated for many different reasons. And all presidents, like all people, are victims of their time who have different views and ideas that aren't necessarily popular today. At the same time, the US president has become more and more of a central figure in and more of a celebrity. So when Americans celebrate their President's Day, they're thinking of particular presidents. The main two presidents who are celebrated at President's Day are obviously America's best two presidents, Lincoln and Washington. Celebrations of George Washington's birthday were common even after his death in 1799, right after his presidency ended in 1797. Because because of all of this, the president celebrations of Washington's birthday became popular as people saw more and more of the reason for celebrating him. After Abraham Lincoln's presidency and assassination, Lincoln's birthday was also celebrated. So you had two holidays celebrated in February for two different presidents. Now, four presidents have been born in February: Lincoln and Washington, William Henry Harrison, who was only president for a month before he died of cholera, and Ronald Reagan, who was the most recent president in the 1980s and is considered the founder of modern Republican conservatism. So these different four different presidents have been born in February. Two of them were widely celebrated independently, and eventually Congress agreed to fuse these celebrations together to make one President's Day to celebrate mainly Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday, but all presidents and all of their achievements, and to ignore the shortcomings of many presidents who did terrible things. And obviously, there is an implicit celebration of presidents like Reagan and Harrison in that, as well as all the other presidents who weren't even born in February. So the third Monday in February, just like the third Monday in January, is reserved for Martin Luther King Day. The third Monday in February is reserved for the celebration of President's Day and is a federal holiday, meaning there is no mail and kids get the day off from school here in the States. Um, and it's obviously showing Americans' rich patriotism, yet the increasing power and prestige of the American presidents. And really, the interesting thing is that it's based on celebrating the two most influential presidents in American history. So, President's Day isn't the most glamorous or popular holiday, and for a lot of kids in schools, it's just a way to get a day off of school, and it's a way for federal workers to not work. And some people, some businesses, some organizations give their people the day off. It's kind of hit and miss. I mean, like for instance, Walmart's not going to be closed tomorrow because of President's Day. It won't be closed at Christmas either, but places that would be closed on Christmas, like a law firm, might very well be open tomorrow for President's Day. It's not the most prestigious or top holiday in American in America, but it perhaps is the most historical one. Every holiday has a history surrounded with it and the way people celebrate it. I'll be discussing more about the particulars of the celebrations and holidays relating to President's Day in my long form video tomorrow about President's Day that will be dropping. And you can ask me about it tomorrow in the Q&A session when I'll be doing another hour of Q&A at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But the American president has obviously become the most important, as is seen as the most powerful person in the United States, if not the world. And part of this has been people ignoring the Constitution, looking at Congress as basically doing a president's dirty work or agenda for him, and the president representing America on the world stage, recommending legislation and building the federal bureaucracy. And obviously, elections and things like that have become almost like sports competitions between the two main sides here in America, the Republicans and the Democrats, which commonly and routinely see people very dissatisfied with both parties and their machinations, yet constantly and firmly voting one way or another because of their own political identities. So, tomorrow is obviously a celebration of two of the best presidents in American history, but it also is a day for Americans to remember the way their system is set up, the influence of the U.S. president, and of course, all the different presidents. And if you want to learn all of the different presidents, then you're at the right place because I have a video where I identify every single one of them in just under a minute. And I have an entire series where I talk about them with more emphasis paid to presidents who had a huge amount of influence, like FDR, excuse me, like FDR, Lincoln, Washington, Teddy Roosevelt, um, and others. There are many underrated American presidents. There are many really overrated American presidents, and there are many terrible ones, and there are some okay ones, and there are ones you have never heard of before. Very, very few people know who Benjamin Harrison was. I do because I studied this stuff, and it's actually quite interesting. So I will be so, and I'm also doing a series right now that will eventually be put into a playlist called I do 5 and 15, where I do 5 facts in 15 seconds, and I talk really fast. If you haven't noticed already, so it's actually fun to do. It's like a challenge to myself. But I'm currently doing one on each and every single American president, with one about Chester A. Arthur scheduled to come out later today. So check that out. That's only 15 seconds. Um, so that is a quick summary of the influence, the structure, and the power of the American president, and also the celebration of President's Day and how it originated with Washington and uh, Lincoln's birthdays, but has become obviously a major holiday. Okay, nerd. Okay, boomer. Um, so just something to consider. So if you like that, consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to look at the chat really fast. We're 100 minutes in, so it's been a nice long afternoon and evening with you guys. So thank you very much for joining us. Um, uh, let me see. St. Patrick was a slave. Okay, let me see. Where did I leave off with the chat? Harry's saying, well, have you heard the story about the slave and how he killed himself when told to kill Anthony? No, I have not. I would like to learn about that. So please, so I'll have to read into that more. Um, Timex, I'm assuming you're referring to the founding fathers. They were pretty smart and pretty much ahead of their time. Harry, I don't think Buchanan could have stopped the Civil War. He would have just delayed it more. I don't think any president could have stopped the Civil War, and I don't think any president could have handled it except Lincoln. And the post-war Reconstruction period probably couldn't have been handled by any president but Lincoln. The guys who went after him, especially Ulysses S. Grant and Rutherford Hayes, tried but really couldn't get anywhere. Um, Angel, it's my absolute pleasure to share it as eloquently as I possibly can. If you liked what you heard and you've liked what I've talked about today, please consider liking and subscribing. Usually my live stream lectures are far more detailed and longer, but I've already been going for a long time. So, and hello, I love music. Great to see you. I love music is one of my Patreon subscribers. And on Patreon, you can get early releases, bonus content, and an exclusive series right now where I am going over the lives, not of the presidents, but of the women behind the power, behind the throne, the first ladies. And some of them have been extremely, first ladies are fascinating to me because some of them have been extremely influential in the formation of the American system. Eleanor Roosevelt, Abigail Adams, were extremely active. Edith Wilson, very active in American politics. And some have been Hillary Clinton, obviously, and some have been extraordinarily, have been kind of advisors on the side and guides on the side. Mary Todd Lincoln, obviously, is a great example of this with Abraham Lincoln. She was his closest friend. And some presidents and first ladies have not gotten along, like John Quincy Adams and Louisa Johnson Adams. And some presidents and some presidents didn't have first ladies; their wives died, or they were divorced, or things like this, and so or something like that. So they had an acting hostess. James Buchanan, who we were just talking about, is an example of a president who had an acting hostess instead of a first lady because he wasn't married and he wasn't even interested in women, by the way, probably. Um, But the truth of the matter is a lot of so the first ladies are absolutely fascinating. Some of them have been influential, some of them have been good advisors, some of them have been representing the domestic side of American life and have become icons for modeling fashion and basically things usually, especially in past times, associated with women. Mamie Eisenhower and Jacqueline Kennedy are examples of this. So first ladies are another fascinating part of American history and have their own history, have their own stories. So yes, and yes, I love music. I love the Patreon content. I particularly enjoy the content on language history. Yeah, I've done some stuff there. So I do some stuff that I don't always get into, and I'm currently working with certain people in the channel, like Ballet Peace is an example of this, to make content that's not just about history, but is history related and things like that. And I've been talking about some of my most faithful friends and admirers about getting their input into the channel so that it's not just my voice you're hearing all the time. It's not just my editing skills that are not that great, but it's a more eclectic channel. So we do a lot of that eclecticism on Patreon, as I Love Music, who is a subscriber there, can tell you. And so thank you for the Patreons. Some of them are here today, and thank you everyone for an enjoyable session and an hour and 45 minutes of an hour of Q&A, and then an hour and a half of Q&A almost, and then about 15 minutes of live stream lecture on the presidents. I'm again catching up because of everything going on in my life, which has just been wild right now. But we will be back tomorrow for a special live stream 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where you can ask me anything you want about history, just like we did the first part of today. Next week, remember, is our birthday. Technically, our birthday was this weekend. It's President's Day weekend, which is a perfect time to start a history channel. But and I can tell you the story about that another time. But next weekend we will be doing a bonus. Uh, there'll be a lot of extra special content. There'll be a 2-hour live stream Q&A. We're gonna have a lot of fun next weekend, so please join us for that. Does anyone have any last comments? This is last call, last comments, questions, topics, feedback, anything of the like. I thank you so much for joining us. Oh, happy birthday! Thank you so much. I love music. Happy birthday to you. And February is a great month indeed. And if you haven't done so yet, please like and subscribe. I have all of that good stuff. Tell all your friends and family, and we will see you tomorrow and then next week. And check out the short and long form content that's always available here on YouTube and on Patreon if you so wish. Take care and have a great time. And remember, love history. Bye bye, all.